Welcome to Hopetales, where ordinary people face extraordinary moments and miracles unfold high above the clouds. The sky over the Atlantic Ocean was unusually clear that morning, painted in shades of soft blue and gold from the rising sun. Flight AC-412, a Boeing 777 filled with nearly 250 passengers, cruised steadily at 33,000 feet. Mothers held their children. Businessmen worked quietly on laptops, and tourists leaned against windows, capturing the endless sky with their phones. Everything seemed normal, too normal. But life has a way of twisting ordinary moments into impossible challenges. Among the passengers sat Ayla, a 19-year-old college student traveling home from a summer internship. She was quiet, observant, and had always been fascinated by airplanes, not the thrill of flying, but the complex machinery behind them. She had spent weekends reading manuals and aviation magazines, learning about engines, flaps, hydraulics, and cockpit controls, though she had never imagined she would need that knowledge in real life. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds had been flying commercial jets for 25 years. Calm, experienced, methodical. But that morning, he noticed a subtle vibration in the right engine, a minor anomaly he thought he could handle. The co-pilot, First Officer Lee, noticed the same vibration but trusted the captain's assessment. No one could have predicted what would happen next. At 33,000 feet, without warning, a loud explosion ripped through the right engine. Sparks flew, smoke trailed behind the fuselage, and the plane shuddered violently. The cabin erupted into chaos. Coffee spilled, luggage tumbled. Passengers screamed, and oxygen masks deployed as the aircraft lurched downward. The pilot struggled to regain control. Alarms screamed, warning lights blinked furiously. Instruments went haywire. Captain Reynolds yanked at the controls, attempting to stabilize the aircraft, but the sudden engine failure created an imbalance, too severe for two humans alone to manage. Ayla, seated near the front, felt the shift immediately. Her heart raced, her stomach churned, but a strange clarity came over her. She noticed the smoke seeping into the cabin, the unusual tilt of the plane, and the flickering cockpit lights visible through the glass panel. Something told her that the pilots were struggling and that they might not make it. Flight attendants rushed past, shouting instructions, trying to calm terrified passengers while themselves holding back panic. One of them stumbled near Ayla's seat, leaving her momentarily alone with a realization. Someone had to act, or hundreds of lives could be lost. A moment later, the cabin tilted sharply to the left. Passengers screamed as the plane shuddered violently. Ayla grabbed the back of her seat to steady herself. Her mind raced. Years of reading, of quietly learning about planes, came rushing back. She remembered diagrams, emergency procedures, control yoke mechanics. She remembered her father, who had once been a small aircraft mechanic, showing her how slight adjustments in control could stabilize a plane. Instinct overrode fear. She stood up, ignoring the trembling of her legs, and moved toward the cockpit. The door was slightly ajar, likely left that way in the chaos. She peeked inside and froze for a moment. The captain was gripping the controls with white-knuckled desperation. The co-pilot struggling with the throttles and switches, alarms screaming around them, red lights bathing the cockpit in ominous glow. The right engine spewed smoke. The instruments flickered uncontrollably, and the plane dipped dangerously again. The co-pilot glanced at her for a split second, eyes wide with silent plea. Ayla didn't hesitate. She pushed past the flight attendants and stepped inside the cockpit. The air was thick with tension and smoke. Every panel, every lever, every button seemed alive, demanding skill she didn't fully possess. But she remembered one thing clearly. Stability comes from control, focus, and courage. Gripping the yoke, she felt the plane respond slightly. Not perfectly, not fully, but enough. The tilt corrected. The descent slowed. The co-pilot exhaled in relief and quickly gestured instructions, pointing at throttle adjustments, flaps, and emergency controls. The cabin behind them was still chaos. Passengers clutched their loved ones, whispered prayers, and braced for impact. But with Ayla's steady hands and instinctive understanding, the plane held its course better than it had moments before. Outside, clouds moved rapidly past the windows. The right engine smoldered, sparks visible, a haunting reminder that any mistake could be fatal. Ayla's arms burned, her muscles quivering from the strain of holding the yoke steady. Sweat ran down her forehead. but she forced herself to focus, adjusting every movement carefully. Seconds stretched into eternity. The plane leveled and a brief calm settled over the cockpit. Alarms continued to blare, but the violent dips had ceased. Ayla allowed herself a single breath, knowing this was just the beginning. The co-pilot looked at her, awe and disbelief in his eyes. He had seen passengers panic and freeze, but never had he imagined a 19-year-old girl could hold the fate of 250 lives in her hands and actually make a difference. But Ayla didn't think about praise. She thought only about survival. She knew the next minutes would be crucial. The engine was failing, fuel levels were uncertain, and landing the plane safely would be a challenge, unlike anything she had ever faced. For now, though, she had done the impossible. She had stopped the descent, stabilized the plane, and given everyone a fighting chance. And in that split second, hovering above 33,000 feet, Ayla realized a truth she would carry forever. Heroes aren't always trained. They're the ones who rise when everyone else falters. Ayla's hands gripped, the yoke like her life depended on it, because it did. The cockpit vibrated under her fingers as the plane wobbled, unstable and lurching violently to the right. The damaged engine groaned with a sound that seemed almost alive, sending smoke curling along the fuselage. Red warning lights flashed relentlessly, illuminating the panic etched across the co-pilot's face. Outside, the horizon twisted in chaotic angles, clouds racing past like a storm-driven river. The sun barely cut through the haze, casting eerie shadows across the cockpit. Every second felt like an eternity. The plane dipped again violently this time, and passengers screamed behind her. The oxygen masks swung like pendulums. Babies cried inconsolably, and luggage rattled down the aisles. Ayla forced herself to focus. Her heart pounded, chest heaving. But she remembered the diagrams, the mechanics, the patterns she had studied for years. She remembered how small adjustments in control could prevent a catastrophic roll or pitch. Her hands shook, but instinct guided her fingers as she subtly pulled the yoke upward, countering the plane's tilt. Slowly, the descent stabilized, just enough to give a momentary reprieve. The co-pilot, recovering from the initial shock, pointed at the throttle. The left engine was straining under extra load. Its RPM fluctuated wildly, threatening further imbalance. Ayla's eyes darted to the controls, trying to memorize every dial, every gauge. She realized there was no time for hesitation. Every movement counted. The turbulence worsened. A sudden gust lifted the plane, throwing passengers against their seat belts and causing luggage to tumble. The plane dipped again, hard. The cabin lurched violently. The overhead bins rattled. A mother held her child tighter, whispering prayers she didn't expect anyone to hear. Every passenger felt the danger, yet none could intervene. Ayla tightened her grip. She leaned her weight into the yoke, muscles burning. Trying to counteract the violent swings, the co-pilot shouted instructions, pointing at instruments, gesturing to flaps and trim controls. Ayla responded, pulling and twisting subtly, listening to the hum and groan of the aircraft, as if it were a living creature responding to her touch. For a moment, the plane leveled. A thin breath of hope filled the cockpit, but relief was short-lived. The smoke from the right engine thickened, curling into the cockpit vents. Sparks flickered dangerously. The fuselage shuddered, and alarms blared even louder. The plane was still in danger. Ayla noticed a sudden dip in altitude, critical levels flashing on the panel. The ground was far below, but the ocean spread endlessly beneath them. If they didn't stabilize soon, there would be no recovery. Her arms trembled, sweat running down her face, but she refused to release the yoke. Every second mattered. Every small adjustment could prevent disaster. The co-pilot attempted to radio for help, but the static was thick, the signal weak. They were isolated, hundreds of miles from the nearest airport. Ayla's mind raced. They couldn't circle, they couldn't wait. The plane needed control now. Another violent gust hit the right wing. The aircraft tilted dangerously, almost tipping. Ayla leaned into the controls, countering the motion, feeling the plane resist her every move. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she held firm. The co-pilot's gestures grew urgent, directing her to maintain level flight while he tried to stabilize engine power. The passengers felt the subtle corrections, the slight leveling. The panic subsided marginally, replaced with tense hope. They didn't know who the girl in the cockpit was, but they sensed that someone, somehow, was fighting for them. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cloud bank ahead. A towering storm wall loomed, dark, immense, and merciless. This wasn't just turbulence. It was nature itself testing them, pushing the plane to its limits. The co-pilot looked at Ayla, his eyes wide with disbelief. She nodded subtly, understanding what needed to be done. Steering clear of the storm wasn't just about moving laterally. It required precision, timing, and perfect coordination with the throttles and flaps. Every gust could destabilize the plane. Every adjustment could be fatal. Ayla adjusted slightly downward to avoid the worst of the turbulence. The plane dipped, then leveled. Sparks from the right engine continued to fly, smoke trailing dangerously, yet she persisted. Sweat dripped into her eyes, stinging, but she ignored it. Every passenger's life depended on her focus. Another violent jolt shook the plane. Ayla's grip almost faltered, but she tightened her hands and leaned into the controls. The co-pilot adjusted the flaps, stabilizing the aircraft. The storm wall loomed closer, and outside clouds twisted violently, lightning cracking across the sky. For a terrifying moment, it seemed impossible. But Ayla's instinct, honed by years of study and quiet observation, guided her fingers. She leveled the wings, countered the dips, and held the plane steady. Inch by inch, second by second, the turbulence began to ease slightly, though the engine continued to fail. Smoke poured from the right engine like a warning. The plane shuddered with each passing second, but Ayla's hands did not tremble as much as before. She had adapted, learned the rhythm of the aircraft, and now every motion was deliberate. The co-pilot exhaled quietly, a mix of relief and disbelief. The girl had done what seemed impossible. She had stabilized the plane, prevented a crash, and bought them precious time. But the crisis wasn't over. They were still hundreds of miles from land. The right engine was dying, and the storm ahead had to be navigated carefully. Ayla glanced at the passengers briefly through the cockpit glass. They were still terrified, but now a glimmer of hope lingered in their eyes. She realized that even in the midst of chaos, courage could ripple outward. The next challenge awaited, navigating the storm, managing the failing engine, and finding a way to land safely. And Ayla, with trembling hands but unwavering resolve, knew that she couldn't falter now, because lives depended on her. The storm ahead was massive, a towering wall of dark clouds stretching endlessly, lightning flashing inside its depths like a living, angry beast. Ayla's eyes narrowed as she gripped the yoke. The plane lurched violently with each gust, metal groaning under the strain. Every vibration, every shudder reminded her that the right engine was failing completely. The cabin behind her shook, passengers screaming, oxygen masks dangling. The co-pilot's hands moved frantically over the controls, throttles and instruments. Sweat ran down his forehead. "We have to get through this," he mouthed, his voice almost lost amid the roaring alarms. Ayla responded instantly, leaning into the yoke, countering every tilt, dip, and sway as best as her strength allowed. Lightning illuminated the cockpit in stark white flashes, highlighting the terror etched across everyone's faces. The plane dipped sharply as a sudden downdraft hit. Ayla's stomach lurched. She gritted her teeth. She pulled back gently on the yoke, leveling the aircraft mid-fall, her muscles screaming in protest. Another gust hit from the side, stronger this time. The wings rolled dangerously, tilting the plane nearly 45 degrees. Outside, the sky was chaos, clouds twisting, winds swirling violently. Inside, the co-pilot shouted instructions, pointing frantically at gauges, emergency switches, anything that could stabilize them. Ayla obeyed, instinct guiding her fingers over the controls. Passengers were screaming now, some praying, some gripping loved ones, others frozen in disbelief. A child cried loudly, while a mother whispered reassurances through trembling lips. Every person's fear pressed on Ayla like a physical weight, but she ignored it. Focus was all that mattered. One misstep, one wrong adjustment, and they would all fall from 33,000 feet into the ocean below. The storm raged around them, winds hitting the fuselage like battering rams. Ayla adjusted the plane slightly downward to avoid the heaviest turbulence, following subtle cues she had learned from manuals and observation. The right engine sputtered, sparking violently. Smoke trailed into the cabin, drifting like a silent warning. The co-pilot signaled urgently, throttle adjustments, flaps, trim. Ayla complied with precision despite the fear clawing at her chest. Time seemed to stretch into eternity. The plane rocked, rolled, and jolted violently, yet inch by inch she held it steady. The passengers sensed the difference. The violent dips lessened. The plane's movements became slightly more predictable. Hope, fragile but tangible, began to ripple through the cabin. Another strike of lightning lit the sky, revealing the enormity of the storm. Clouds twisted like massive black tornadoes, rain lashing invisible against the plane. Turbulence slammed the fuselage from every direction. The plane dipped again, faster this time. Oxygen masks swung. A tray of food crashed against the ceiling. Ayla leaned harder into the yoke, pulling, twisting, countering, feeling every vibration, every resistance as if the plane were an extension of her own body. The co-pilot gave a nod, signaling a small measure of relief. The descent had been arrested. The roll corrected. The violent dips had lessened. They were surviving. But the right engine's sputtering and smoke reminded them that survival was temporary. They needed to land soon, and finding a safe area hundreds of miles from the nearest airport was still a challenge. Ayla scanned the instruments, the horizon, and the radar. Miles ahead lay dense clouds, but faint patches of blue sky suggested calmer winds. Below, the ocean stretched infinitely, offering no landing zone. The storm had a jagged edge. Only by navigating carefully could they hope to exit it. Another violent gust hit, lifting the plane momentarily. Ayla's arms burned, but she adjusted subtly, lowering the nose slightly to maintain altitude. Sparks erupted from the right engine again, a harsh reminder of the critical failure. The co-pilot shouted over the alarms, pointing toward the flaps and throttles. Ayla responded without hesitation. Every movement deliberate, every adjustment calculated. Minutes passed like hours. The turbulence persisted, but Ayla's focus never wavered. The plane steadied, then leveled, then tilted slightly. Each movement required precise coordination with the co-pilot, who guided her silently. Passengers behind them were aware of the extraordinary effort. Unfolding in the cockpit, they felt hope, fragile but real. Finally, the storm began to thin slightly. The thick black clouds gave way to smaller grade formations. Lightning strikes became less frequent. The plane shuddered, but the violent peaks of turbulence were behind them. Ayla exhaled sharply, her arms trembling, sweat dripping from her forehead. They had survived the worst, but ahead lay another challenge. Landing with a failing engine, low altitude, and no nearby airport. Every decision from here would determine whether hundreds of lives would be saved or lost. Ayla glanced at the co-pilot. His eyes, wide with disbelief and awe, conveyed a silent truth. She had done what no one expected. A 19-year-old girl had stabilized a passenger plane during the fiercest storm they had ever flown into, yet the crisis was far from over. Beyond the thinning clouds, miles of open sea and scattered islands awaited. The plane needed a flat, clear space for emergency landing, or the miracle that had kept them alive so far would end in tragedy. Ayla tightened her grip on the yoke, her jaw set. Her arms burned, her body ached, but determination burned brighter. She had learned to trust instinct, knowledge, and courage. She had carried hundreds of lives this far, and she would not falter now. The storm was behind them, but the final battle for survival had only just begun. The storm had finally thinned, leaving a bruised sky behind. Jagged clouds gave way to streaks of sunlight, but the ocean below still stretched endlessly. The right engine was nearly dead. Smoke poured from its casing like a warning that time was running out. Every second mattered. Ayla's hands gripped the yoke until her fingers ached. Muscles burning, arms trembling, but her focus never wavered. The co-pilot leaned closer, pointing toward a faint strip of land visible through the thinning clouds. It wasn't an airport. It wasn't even an airstrip. But it was flat, long enough, and free from obstacles. It was their only chance. Ayla's heart raced. Her mind calculated every variable in seconds. Wind speed, remaining engine power, flaps, throttle response, plane weight, passenger balance. Every detail mattered. She adjusted the plane slightly downward, wings level, flaps deployed. The fuselage shuddered as the failing engine groaned, sparks flying, but she maintained control. The co-pilot coordinated with her, his gestures urgent but precise. He guided her on throttle adjustments and minor corrections, his trust in her growing with every second. Ayla responded instinctively, her movements calm despite the storm of adrenaline coursing through her veins. Below, the land approached. green fields broken by small trees, a river curving far from the plane's path. She had to land between the trees and the river. Any miscalculation and disaster would strike. She adjusted altitude carefully, aligning the plane with the longest stretch of flat land she could see. The wind gusted, testing her control, but she held firm. Her fingers burned from gripping the yoke, but she ignored the pain. Every passenger's life depended on her precision. The plane descended, slowly, steadily, but the failing engine sputtered, its hum weak, threatening to fail completely. Sparks flickered violently, smoke billowing. The plane jolted slightly, a reminder of how fragile their situation was. Passengers in the cabin braced themselves, holding hands, whispering prayers, hearts racing. Some sensed hope. Some held on to despair. But none could act, none except the girl in the cockpit. Ayla adjusted her approach. The landing gear was deployed, and she felt the slight grinding of the wheels locking in place. Dust and grass rushed toward them. She kept the wings level, her fingers precise. First contact. The front wheels hit the ground with a jolt, bouncing slightly. Ayla pulled gently on the yoke to prevent a nosedive. The fuselage rattled, metal groaning. The co-pilot's hands moved quickly, cutting throttle and assisting with flaps. The plane skidded over the uneven terrain, stones and dust scattering in its wake. The wings wobbled dangerously. Sparks from the failing engine flew, further as the fuselage ground against the rough surface. Ayla's heart raced, but she maintained focus, guiding the plane inch by inch. Every second felt like an eternity. Then slowly, miraculously, the plane slid to a complete stop. Silence. The cabin was tense for a moment. Then realization hit. They were alive. Every passenger was still breathing. The emergency landing had succeeded. Relief washed over the cabin in waves. Some passengers sobbed. Some hugged strangers. Some whispered thanks, tears streaming down their faces. Ayla's hands fell from the yoke, trembling. She sank into her seat, exhausted beyond measure, her body shaking from adrenaline and relief. The co-pilot exhaled. A mixture of disbelief and gratitude etched across his face. Outside, rescue teams arrived within minutes. Paramedics attended to the captain first, stabilizing him. Passengers exited the plane slowly, still in shock but unharmed. The media would later report the story, calling it a miracle. And indeed it was. Because a 19-year-old girl, untrained in emergency landings, inexperienced in cockpit crisis, had done the impossible. She had faced a failing engine, turbulence, and panic, and she had saved hundreds of lives. Later, when the captain recovered, he sought Ayla personally. He found her quiet, humble, hands tucked behind her back, almost as if she didn't realize the magnitude of what she had done. His eyes filled with tears as he placed a hand on her shoulder. No words could capture the gratitude he felt. Yet in that silent gesture, Ayla understood the truth. Heroes are not born in uniforms. Heroes are born in moments of courage, in choices made when the world expects you to fail. Ayla, the teenager who faced the storm and the engine, had become a symbol of hope. News outlets, social media, and aviation experts hailed her bravery. But she didn't care about recognition. She cared about one thing, that every single passenger walked away alive. Months later, she returned to the cockpit, not as a pilot, but as a visitor invited to see the plane that had almost been lost and to meet the crew she had saved. The captain smiled, pointing to the controls where she had fought through fear and chaos. He whispered a truth that would stay with her forever. Some heroes don't wear badges. Some heroes just step up when no one else can. And you saved us all. The sun set over the horizon, golden light reflecting off the fuselage. The plane rested safely, the storm behind them. Ayla stood beside the aircraft, exhausted, victorious, and forever changed. She had done the impossible. She had turned fear into courage, and she had shown the world that hope, determination, and bravery can shine even in the darkest skies.